Today, we're going to talk about foods that may increase your cancer risk, and I want to start by giving you the bottom line right up front. The strongest evidence points to processed meats like bacon and deli meats, alcohol at any level, and ultra-processed foods as the dietary factors most clearly linked to increased cancer risk. But before you feel anxious about your breakfast choices or last night's dinner, let me put this in perspective. The absolute risk increases we're talking about for most of these foods are relatively modest for any individual person. What matters far more is your overall dietary pattern over time, and the good news is that meaningful changes are possible at any age. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through exactly what the research shows, what the actual numbers mean for you, how cooking methods matter as much as food choices, and most importantly, practical steps you can take starting today that are supported by solid evidence. Before we dive deeper, I need to be clear that this is educational content based on published research. It's not medical advice, and it doesn't replace talking to your own healthcare provider. Everyone's situation is different, especially if you have existing health conditions, a family history of cancer, or you're taking medications. Always discuss significant dietary changes with your doctor who knows your specific medical history. Let me start by explaining how food relates to cancer risk in the first place, because understanding this helps make sense of all the recommendations you'll hear. Cancer develops through a process where cells accumulate genetic mutations over many years or even decades. It's not like flipping a light switch. Think of it more like a probability game where certain exposures increase the odds that those mutations will happen, but they don't guarantee cancer will develop. This is why we use language like increases risk rather than causes cancer. The foods we're going to discuss increase the probability of cancer developing, but most people who eat these foods will not get cancer from them. Now, for those of us over 50, there are some age-related changes that make this conversation particularly relevant. As we age, our cells' DNA repair mechanisms become less efficient. We've accumulated more oxidative damage over the decades. Our metabolic rate slows down. For women, hormonal changes after menopause affect cancer risk. Our baseline inflammation levels tend to be higher. All of these factors mean that our cancer susceptibility is naturally higher than it was when we were younger, which makes dietary choices more important, not less. There are really three main ways that food can influence cancer risk. First, some foods contain compounds that directly damage DNA or promote mutations. Second, certain dietary patterns promote obesity, chronic inflammation, or hormone disruption, which create an environment where cancer is more likely to develop. And third, when we fill up on less healthy foods, we displace the protective foods like vegetables, fruits, and fiber that help defend against cancer. Keep these mechanisms in mind as we go through the specific foods. Let's talk about processed meats first, because this is where we have the strongest evidence. I'm talking about bacon, sausage, hot dogs, deli meats, and other meats that have been cured, smoked, or had preservatives added. In 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, evaluated over 800 studies and classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen. Now, when people hear this, they sometimes panic because tobacco is also Group 1. But that classification means we're certain it causes cancer, not that it's equally dangerous. The actual risk increase is much, much smaller than smoking. Here's what the numbers actually show. Eating 50 grams of processed meat daily, which is about 2 slices of bacon or 1 hot dog, increases your risk of colorectal cancer by about 18% in relative terms. Now let me translate that into absolute risk, because this is where context really matters. Your baseline lifetime risk of colorectal cancer is around 4 to 5%. An 18% increase of that baseline risk means your risk goes up to about 5 to 6%. In other words, if 100 people eat this amount of processed meat daily for decades, we'd expect about 1 additional case of colorectal cancer compared to people who don't eat processed meat. That's real. That's meaningful at a population level. But it's also not a guarantee that you personally will get cancer from eating bacon. The mechanism here is important to understand. Processed meats contain compounds called nitrates and nitrites, which are used as preservatives. When these interact with proteins in your digestive system, they form N-nitroso compounds, which can damage the DNA in your colon cells. Additionally, processed meats contain heme-iron, which is a type of iron that catalyzes the formation of these harmful compounds. The smoking and curing processes can also create other carcinogenic compounds. Red meat, which includes beef, pork, and lamb that hasn't been processed, falls into a slightly different category. The same international agency classified red meat as Group 2A, which means probably carcinogenic to humans. The evidence here is strong but not quite as definitive as for processed meats. Studies show that eating about 100 grams of red meat daily, roughly a small steak, increases colorectal cancer risk by about 17% in relative terms. Again, translating to absolute risk, this takes your lifetime colorectal cancer risk from about 5% to maybe 5.8%. What's interesting about red meat is that how you cook it matters tremendously. A large study from the National Institutes of Health followed over 500,000 adults and found that people who regularly ate well-done meat had a 40 to 60% higher risk of certain cancers compared to people who ate meat cooked rare or medium. This is because cooking meat at high temperatures, especially grilling, frying, or broiling, creates compounds called heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are the charred bits you see on grilled meat, and they're probable carcinogens. The good news here is that you can dramatically reduce these compounds by changing how you cook. Marinating meat before grilling, cooking at lower temperatures, avoiding charring, and flipping frequently can reduce these harmful compounds by more than 90%. Now let's talk about ultra-processed foods, which is a category that's gotten a lot of attention recently. These are foods that have been significantly altered from their original form and typically contain additives, preservatives, artificial colors, or flavors. Think packaged snacks, sodas, instant meals, reconstituted meat products, and many packaged baked goods. A large study in France called the Nutrinet Santé cohort followed 105,000 people and found that for every 10% increase in ultra-processed food consumption, there was about a 12% increase in overall cancer risk. This association was strongest for breast and ovarian cancers. Now, I need to be honest about the limitations here. Ultra-processed is a broad category, and it's not always clear exactly which aspects of these foods drive the risk. Is it the additives? Is it compounds that leach from packaging? Is it the high sugar and salt content? Or is it simply that people who eat a lot of ultra-processed foods are also eating fewer protective whole foods? Probably all of these factors play a role. Also, people who consume a lot of ultra-processed foods often have other behaviors that increase cancer risk, so sorting out causation is tricky. But the pattern is consistent across multiple large studies. A follow-up analysis from the European Perspective Investigation into Cancer and Nutrition, which followed people across 10 European countries, confirmed similar findings in 2022. The practical takeaway is that focusing on whole, minimally processed foods appears to offer real benefits. If you could replace 30% of your calories from ultra-processed foods with whole foods, based on these studies, you might reduce your overall cancer risk by somewhere between 10 and 15%. That's meaningful. And you'd also see benefits for your metabolic health, blood pressure, and inflammation levels. Alcohol deserves special attention because the evidence here is particularly clear and it challenges some common assumptions. A comprehensive analysis published in The Lancet in 2021, reviewing over 100 studies, concluded that there is no safe level of alcohol consumption when it comes to cancer risk. Even one drink per day increases risk, and the risk goes up in a linear fashion with every additional drink. For breast cancer specifically, which is a major concern for women over 50, one drink daily increases risk by about 5 to 9%. For colorectal cancer, it's about 7%. For cancers of the mouth, throat, and esophagus, the increases are even higher. Let me put this in absolute terms for breast cancer, since that's often the biggest concern. The baseline lifetime risk of breast cancer for women is about 12.5%. One daily drink increases that to somewhere between 13.1 and 13.6%. That translates to about 6 to 11 additional breast cancer cases per 1,000 women. The mechanism is well understood. Alcohol breaks down into acetaldehyde in your body, which is a known carcinogen that damages DNA and interferes with DNA repair. Alcohol also affects hormone levels, particularly estrogen, which can fuel certain types of breast cancer. Now, I know this is different from what you might have heard about the heart benefits of moderate drinking, particularly red wine. The research on cardiovascular benefits has been mixed, and recent large studies have called even those benefits into question. What we can say is that any potential heart benefits need to be weighed against clear cancer risks, and for many people, especially women, the cancer risks outweigh potential benefits. Let's talk about added sugars, because this one is a bit more complex. Foods high in added sugars, particularly sugar-sweetened beverages like sodas and sweetened juices, have been linked to increased cancer risk in several studies. The same French cohort I mentioned earlier found that each daily serving of sugary drinks was associated with an 8% increase in overall cancer risk and a 22% increase in breast cancer risk in postmenopausal women specifically. This was confirmed by analysis of the Nurses' Health Study in 2020. However, the mechanism here is less direct than with processed meats or alcohol. Sugar itself hasn't been classified as a carcinogen. The link appears to work primarily through obesity, inflammation, and insulin resistance. When you consume a lot of added sugar, especially in liquid form, it promotes weight gain. Excess body fat, particularly around your midsection, increases inflammation and insulin levels, both of which create an environment where cancer is more likely to develop. So the relationship is real, but it's more about the metabolic consequences of excess sugar than about sugar directly damaging DNA. The evidence-based recommendation is to keep added sugars below 10% of your daily calories, which works out to about 50 grams or 12 teaspoons per day. To put that in perspective, one 12-ounce can of regular soda contains about 40 grams of added sugar. Eliminating or dramatically reducing sugar-sweetened beverages is probably the single most impactful change you can make in this category. Before we move to recommendations, I want to address a few common misconceptions because there's a lot of confusing information out there. First, you might hear that organic or grass-fed red meat doesn't increase cancer risk. Unfortunately, that's not what the research shows. The cancer risk from red meat relates primarily to its heme iron content and how it's cooked, not to how the animal was raised. Grass-fed beef may have a slightly better fatty acid profile, but the cancer risk appears similar. The same goes for organic processed meats. They still contain the nitrates and nitrites and heme iron that create those problematic N-nitroso compounds. Another myth is that if a food is carcinogenic, any amount will cause cancer. This reflects a misunderstanding of how carcinogens work. Dose and duration matter. Having a hot dog at a baseball game once a month poses minimal risk. The studies showing increased cancer risk are looking at regular sustained consumption over many years. Most carcinogens increase probability in a dose-dependent way. More exposure over more time equals higher probability, but even heavy exposure doesn't guarantee cancer will develop. Some people believe that certain superfoods can neutralize the cancer risk from processed meats or other harmful foods. I wish this were true, but it's not how it works. While foods rich in antioxidants and phytonutrients do support your health and may have some protective effects, they don't cancel out exposure to known carcinogens. You can't have a side of blueberries with your bacon and call it even. What matters is your overall dietary pattern. There's also a misconception that these risks only matter if you have a family history of cancer. Actually, most cancer cases occur in people without strong family history. While family history does increase your baseline risk, and that makes these dietary factors even more important for those individuals, the carcinogenic effects of these foods apply to everyone. So let's talk about what you can actually do with this information. I want to give you practical steps that are based on the evidence we've discussed and that are realistic to implement. First, when it comes to processed meats, the recommendation is to limit consumption to less than one serving per week if possible. I know for many people, especially if you grew up with bacon and eggs for breakfast or sandwiches with deli meat for lunch, this feels like a significant change. You don't have to go to zero overnight. Start by finding substitutes. Instead of deli meat in your sandwich, try grilled chicken breast or canned tuna or salmon. If you love bacon, consider turkey bacon as an occasional option, though be aware it's still processed and should be limited. Use fresh sausage instead of cured sausage when you can. The key is reducing frequency and finding alternatives you actually enjoy, because changes you hate won't stick. For red meat, a reasonable goal based on the evidence is limiting consumption to 3 to 4 servings per week with a total cooked weight of about 350 to 500 grams per week. One helpful strategy is to think of meat as a condiment or flavoring rather than the centerpiece of your meal. Instead of an 8-ounce steak, have a 3-ounce portion with a large serving of vegetables. Try a meatless Monday or choose fish or poultry for several meals per week. When you do cook red meat, use methods that minimize those heterocyclic amines we talked about. Baking, steaming, stewing, and slow cooking are better than high-temperature grilling or frying. If you do grill, marinate the meat first, preferably in something acidic like lemon juice or vinegar. Keep the temperature moderate, flip frequently, and trim off any charred portions before eating. These simple steps can reduce carcinogenic compound formation by more than 90%. When it comes to ultra-processed foods, I want to be realistic about this. Whole foods and home cooking are ideal, but I understand that time, budget, and access are real constraints. You don't need to be perfect. The goal is to gradually shift the balance. Start by identifying the ultra-processed foods you eat most often and see where you can make swaps. Choose plain yogurt and add your own fruit instead of buying pre-sweetened yogurt. Buy plain oatmeal and add cinnamon and berries instead of the flavored instant packets. Choose whole fruits over fruit snacks. When you do buy packaged foods, read the ingredient list. If it's long and full of things you don't recognize, that's usually a sign of heavy processing. Frozen vegetables and canned beans are minimally processed and are perfectly fine choices. Batch cooking on weekends, if that's feasible for you, can make it easier to avoid ultra-processed convenience foods during busy weekdays. For alcohol, the evidence suggests that less is better. Current guidelines suggest less than 1 drink daily for women and less than 2 for men. But honestly, given the cancer data, even lower consumption is probably better. If you currently drink daily, consider having several alcohol-free days each week. If you drink socially, that's fine, but you might alternate alcoholic drinks with water or try some of the non-alcoholic alternatives that have gotten much better in recent years. If you have a family history of breast cancer or you're at higher risk for other reasons, this is particularly important to discuss with your doctor, and I should note that if you have a history of alcohol dependence, any changes to your drinking need to be done with medical supervision. Reducing added sugars, particularly from beverages, is one of the more straightforward changes. If you currently drink regular soda or sweetened tea or juice, start by cutting back gradually. Mix juice with sparkling water, switch to unsweetened tea or coffee, and let your taste adjust. It takes a couple of weeks, but your taste preferences genuinely do adapt. Water is always the best choice, but if plain water is boring, try infusing it with fruit or herbs. Be aware that sugar appears on labels under dozens of different names. Anything ending in O's, like sucrose, fructose, dextrose, is sugar. So is honey, agave, maple syrup, and corn syrup. Your body processes all of these similarly. Here's what might be the most important point. Rather than fixating on individual foods to avoid, the strongest evidence supports adopting an overall healthy dietary pattern. Studies on Mediterranean-style diets and DASH-style diets, which emphasize vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, fish, and olive oil while minimizing red and processed meats, sweets, and ultra-processed foods, show a 10 to 20% lower overall cancer risk. These patterns also benefit your heart, your brain, your metabolic health, and your longevity. The cumulative effect of a healthy dietary pattern is much more powerful than any single food change. Now let me be clear about when you should talk to your doctor. If you have a personal history of cancer or a strong family history, especially of colorectal or breast cancer, discuss these dietary recommendations with your healthcare provider. They may have more specific guidance based on your risk profile. If you have inflammatory bowel disease or a history of colon polyps, dietary changes are particularly important and should be coordinated with your gastroenterologist. If you're on medications, especially blood thinners or diabetes medications, significant dietary changes can affect how these drugs work, so check with your doctor first. If you're considering reducing alcohol and you have a history of heavy drinking or dependence, you need medical supervision because withdrawal can be dangerous. And obviously, if you're experiencing any concerning symptoms like unexplained weight loss, changes in bowel habits, persistent digestive issues, or unusual fatigue, see your doctor promptly. These aren't necessarily cancer, but they warrant evaluation. I also want to acknowledge some things we genuinely don't know yet. We don't fully understand why some people who consume large amounts of processed meat never develop cancer, while others with minimal exposure do develop it, beyond the genetic factors we've identified. We don't know if there's a true safe threshold for processed meat consumption or if any amount carries some risk. For ultra-processed foods, we're still sorting out which specific aspects drive cancer risk the most. Is it particular additives? Is it the processing itself? Is it packaging materials? We need more research. We also don't know with certainty whether reducing these foods at age 50 or beyond provides as much benefit as avoiding them throughout life, though the evidence suggests it's never too late to benefit from healthier choices. There are also emerging concerns that we don't have good long-term data on yet. Microplastics in food and water are a growing concern, but we don't have decades of human health data yet. Some novel food additives approved in recent years haven't been studied long enough to know their long-term effects. Highly processed plant-based meat alternatives are interesting because they're technically ultra-processed, but they replace red meat, so the net effect isn't clear yet. Let me bring all of this together for you. The evidence shows that certain foods, particularly processed meats, excess alcohol, and ultra-processed foods, do increase cancer risk in ways that are measurable and consistent across large populations. The mechanisms are reasonably well understood. However, the absolute risk increases for any individual are generally modest. For processed meat, we're talking about an increase from about 5% lifetime colorectal cancer risk to about 6%. That's real, but it's not a guarantee of cancer, and it's not in the same universe as the risk from smoking. What matters most is not obsessing over any single food, but looking at your overall dietary pattern over time. Small, sustainable changes accumulate. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to eliminate every food on this list. Progress matters more than perfection. If you can gradually reduce processed meats, moderate red meat consumption, minimize ultra-processed foods, reduce alcohol, cut back on added sugars, and modify your cooking methods to avoid charring, while increasing your intake of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and legumes, you're making meaningful changes. These dietary shifts can reduce your cancer risk by somewhere between 10 and 20% based on the research, and you'll also see benefits for your cardiovascular health, cognitive function, and metabolic health. For those of us over 50, it's absolutely not too late to benefit from these changes. Your body responds to healthier inputs at any age. Yes, we've accumulated some exposure over decades, but we also have decades ahead of us potentially, and every year of healthier eating reduces risk going forward. If you found this information helpful, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to this channel. I make evidence-based health content specifically for adults over 50, and subscribing helps me continue doing this work. If you know someone who might benefit from this information, sharing the video helps spread accurate, non-sensationalized health information. If you have questions or topics you'd like me to cover in future videos, leave them in the comments. I do read them, and I use them to guide what I create next. And as always, remember that this is educational content. For decisions about your specific health situation, talk to your healthcare provider who knows your medical history and can give you personalized guidance. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.